Hey guys, Mr. Palmer here. I hope you guys are doing well, staying safe, not getting too bored, and I hope you're enjoying these readings. I'm kind of really getting into the book. The last couple of chapters have really um, said a lot about what is forming Frederick Douglass at this point, and it's just crazy hearing how, like, knowing the impact he had, what he had to do to get to this point. It's I don't know, it's really cool. I'm enjoying it a lot, even if it's a hard read. So I'm looking forward to this next chapter. We are now at chapter 9. So get your coffee or tea or water or whatever, your art supplies, and sit down and let's read. I know it's not the same as when we're in the classroom, but I mean, whatever. Alright, so for our questions. First question. There are 13 questions, so I'm guessing this is going to be a longer chapter. Why does Frederick now know the date? Question 2. Who is Frederick's newest master? Question 3. What rules of slaveholding does Master Thomas Old violate? Question 4. How did the slaves get food? Question 5. Why does Frederick say that adopted slaveholders are the worst? Question 6. What, according to Frederick, happens to Master Thomas Old after his conversion to Christianity? Why? Question 7. Why does Frederick feel irony in the fact that the slaves' Sabbath school is discontinued? Question 8. Why does Frederick let Master Thomas's horse run away? Chapter 9. Again, Frederick compares the treatment of slaves to the treatment of horses. How? Question 10. How does Master Thomas propose to break Frederick? Oh, I don't like the sound of that. Question 11. Why is the use of the verb to break ironic? Question 12. Why was Mr. Covey's reputation for breaking slaves of great value to him? I keep doing that. Question 13. Why does Frederick suggest that Mr. Covey's pious soul add to his reputation as a slave breaker? Wow. Well, this does not exactly sound like an easy chapter. So, let's get started. I have now reached a period of my life where I can give dates. I left Baltimore and went to live with Mr. Thomas Old at St. Michael's in March of 1832. It was now more than 7 years since I lived with him in the family of my old master on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. We, of course, were now almost entire strangers to each other. He was new to me, a new master, and I to him, a new slave. I was ignorant of his temper and disposition. He was equally so of mine. A very short time, however, brought us into full acquaintance with one another. I was made acquainted with his wife not less than with himself. They were well matched, being equally mean and cruel. I was now for the first time, during a space of more than 7 years, made to feel the painful gnawing of hunger, a something which I had not experienced before since I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. It went hard enough with me then, when I could look back to no period at which I had enjoyed a sufficiency. It was tenfold harder after living in Mr. Hugh's family, where I had always enough to eat, and of that which was good. I have said Mr. Thomas was a mean man. He was not so. Not to give a slave enough to eat is regarded as the most aggravated development of meanness, even among slaveholders. The rule is, no matter how coarse the food, only let there be enough of it. This is a theory, and in the part of Maryland from which I came, it is a general practice. Though there are many exceptions, Master Thomas gave us enough of neither coarse nor fine food. There were 4 slaves of us in the kitchen: my sister Eliza, my Aunt Priscilla, Henry, and myself. And we were allowed less than a half a bushel of cornmeal per week. Wow. And very little else, either in the shape of meat or vegetables. It was not enough for us to subsist upon. We were therefore reduced to the wretched necessity of living at the expense of our neighbors. This we did by begging and stealing, whichever came handy in the time of need, the one being considered as legitimate as the other. A great many times have we poor creatures been nearly perishing with hunger, when food in abundance lay mouldering in the safe and smokehouse, and our pious mistress was aware of the fact. And yet that mistress and her husband would kneel every morning and pray that God would bless them in basket and store. Bad as all slaveholders are, we seldom meet one destitute of every element of character commanding respect. My master was one of this rare sort. I did not know of one single noble act ever performed by him. The leading trait in his character was meanness, and if there were any other elements in his nature, it was made subject to this. He was mean, and like most other mean men, he lacked the ability to conceal his meanness. Captain Old was not born a slaveholder. He had been a poor man, master only of a bay-craft. He came into possession of all his slaves by marriage, and of all men, adopted slaveholders are the worst. He was cruel, but cowardly. He commanded without firmness. In the enforcement of his rules, he was at times rigid, and at times lax. At times he spoke to his slaves with the firmness of Napoleon and the fury of a demon. At other times he might as well be mistaken for an inquirer who had lost his way. He did nothing of himself. He might have passed for a lion, but for his ears, and all things noble which he attempted, his own meanness shone most conspicuous. His airs, his words, and his actions were the airs, words, and actions of a born slaveholders, and being assumed, were awkward enough. He was not even a good imitator. He possessed all the disposition to deceive, but wanted the power. Having no resources within himself, he was compelled to be the copyist of many, and being such, he was forever the victim of inconsistency, and of consequence he was an object of contempt, and was held as such even by his slaves. The luxury of having slaves of his own to wait upon him was something new and unprepared for. He was a slaveholder, without the ability to hold slaves. He found himself incapable of managing his slaves either by force, fear, or fraud. We seldom called him master. We generally called him Captain Old, and were hardly disposed to title him at all. I doubt not that our conduct had much to do with making him appear awkward, and of consequence fretful. Our want of reverence for him must have perplexed him greatly. He wished to have us call him master, but lacked the firmness necessary to command us to do so. His wife used to insist upon our calling him so, but to no purpose. In August, 1832, my master attended a Methodist camp meeting held in the Bayside, Talbot County, and there experienced religion. I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and that, if he did not do this, it would, at any rate, make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed in both of these respects. It neither made him to be humane to his slaves, nor to emancipate him. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in all his ways, for I believe him to have been a much worse man after his conversion than before. Prior to his conversion, he relied upon his own depravity to shield and sustain him in his savage barbarity, but after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slave-holding cruelty. He made the greatest pretensions to piety. His house was the house of prayer. He prayed morning, noon, and night. He very soon distinguished himself among his brethren, and soon made a class leader and exhorter. His activity in revivals was great, and he proved himself an instrument in the hands of the church in converting many souls. His house was the preacher's home. They used to take great pleasure in coming there to put up, for while he starved us, he stuffed them. We had 3 or 4 preachers there at a time. The names of those who used to come most frequently while I lived there were Mr. Storks, Mr. Erie, Mr. Humphrey, and Mr. Hickey. I have also seen Mr. George Cookman at our house. We slaves loved Mr. Cookman. We believed him to be a good man. We thought him instrumental in getting Mr. Samuel Harrison, a very rich slaveholder, to emancipate his slaves, and by some means got the impression that he was laboring to effect the emancipation of all the slaves. When he was at our house, we were sure to be called into prayers. When others were there, we were sometimes called in and sometimes not. Mr. Cookman took more notice of us than either of the other ministers. He could not come among us without betraying his sympathy for us, and stupid as we were, we had the sagacity, wow, what a word, to see it. While I lived with my masters in St. Michael's, there was a white young man, a Mr. Wilson, who proposed to keep a Sabbath school for the instruction of such slaves as might be disposed to learn to read the New Testament. We met but 3 times, when Mr. West and Mr. Fairbanks, both class leaders, with many others, came upon us with sticks and other missiles, drove us off, and forbade us to meet again. Thus ended our little Sabbath school in the pious town of St. Michael's. I've said that my master found religious sanction for his cruelty. As an example, I will state one of the many facts going to prove the charge. I've seen him tie up a lame woman and whip her with a heavy cowskin upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm red blood to drip. And in justification of the bloody deed, he would quote the passage of Scripture, "He that knoweth his master's will, and does not, shall be beaten with many stripes." Master would keep this lacerated young woman tied up in this horrid situation 4 or 5 hours at a time. I've known him to tie her up early in the morning, and whip her before breakfast, leave her, go to his store, return at dinner, and whip her again, cutting her in the places that already made raw with his cruel lash. The secret of the master's cruelty toward Henny is found quite in the fact of her being almost helpless. When quite a child, she fell into the fire and burned herself horribly. Her hands were so burnt that she never got to the use of them. She could do very little but bear heavy burdens. She was to master a bill of expense, and as he was a mean man, she was a constant offense to him. He seemed desirous of getting the poor girl out of existence. He gave her away once to his sister, but, being a poor gift, she was not disposed to keep her. Finally, my benevolent master, to use his own words, set her adrift to take care of herself. Here was a recently converted man, holding on upon the mother, and at the same time turning out her helpless child to starve and die. Master Thomas was one of the many pious slaveholders who hold slaves to the very charitable purpose of taking care of them. My master and myself had quite a number of differences. He found me unsuitable to his purpose. My city life, he said, had had a very pernicious effect upon me. It almost ruined me for every good purpose, and fitted me for everything which was bad. One of my greatest faults was that of letting his horse run away, and to go down to his father-in-law's farm, which is about 5 miles from St. Michael's. I would then have to go after it. My reason for this kind of carelessness, or carefulness, was that I could always get something to eat when I went there. Master William Hamilton, my master's father-in-law, always gave his slaves enough to eat. I never left there hungry, no matter how great the need of my speedy return. Master Thomas at length said he would stand it no longer. I had lived with him 9 months, during which time he had given me a number of severe whippings, all to no good purpose. He resolved to put me out, as he said, to be broken, and for this purpose he let me for 1 year to a man named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey was a poor man, a farm renter. He rented the place upon which he lived, as also the hands with it which he tilled. Mr. Covey had acquired a very high reputation for breaking young slaves, and this reputation was of the immense value to him. It enabled him to get his farm tilled with much less expense to him than he could have had it done without such reputation. Some slaveholders thought it not so much loss to allow Mr. Covey to have their slaves 1 year, for the sake of the training to which they were subjected, without any other compensation. He could hire young help with great ease, in consequence of this reputation. Added to the natural good qualities of Mr. Covey, he was a professor of religion, a pious soul, and a member and class leader of the Methodist Church, and all this added weight to his reputation to being a slave breaker. I was aware of all the facts, having been made acquainted with them by a young man who had lived there. I nevertheless made the change gladly, for I was sure of getting enough to eat, which is not the smallest consideration to a hungry man. Wow. Okay. So, let's go through these questions. Why does Frederick now know the date? You guys know? Well, I guess he learned them. So, since he now knows how to read and write, he can tell time. Question 2. Who is Frederick's newest master? Now, we did talk about this in the last chapter. His newest master is the brother to the people he was living with. So Mr. Thomas Old has him, but I guess Frederick, he kept doing things on purpose to have to leave the farm because he was hungry, and so now he was sent away to a Mr. Covey. So I guess technically that could be his newest master. So, what rule of slaveholding does Master Thomas Old violate? Well, they talk about it. Even among slaveholders, they always gave their slaves enough to eat, because if you don't have enough to eat, you're not going to work. And Mr. Thomas Old doesn't do that. He makes his slaves go hungry, which is nothing but cruelty. So because of that, how did the slaves get food? You guys remember? Well, they either have to steal it or beg for it. I mean, they were starving. They would have died if they didn't do that. Why does Frederick say that adopted slaveholders are the worst? he says that because Mr. Ould got everything through marriage, so he never owned a slave before. But he wanted the pretension, and he wanted to be a leader without knowing how to be one. The slaves actually wanted to respect him, and there was nothing in him worth respecting. He couldn't have command over them. Yeah. What, according to Frederick, happens to Master Thomas Ould after his conversion to Christianity, and why? This made me really sad. Mr. Ould converted to Christianity and became even meaner than he was before. According to Frederick, that's because before he used his own, I don't know, character and life as an excuse for why he was so mean to them. But now he had a firm basis that other people in the community could understand, because he would quote scripture and he pretended to be this godly person. So he had a justification, according to society, for his actions. Why does Frederick find irony in the fact that the slave Sabbath school is discontinued? Well, because it's supposed to be the day of rest. The Sabbath, for Christians and Jews, whatever day the Sabbath is, it's supposed to be a day of rest. And so not only were they not allowed to have that day of rest, they couldn't learn the New Testament, which was supposed to be for everybody. According to Christianity, the New Testament will save those who are lost. And the slaveholders don't want the slaves to learn the New Testament. And I think, again, that goes back to that idea of if a slave has any indication of who they are and their humanity, and they can think for themselves, it will not make them a good slave anymore. It's so contradictory to religion. It just is. Okay. Why does Frederick let Master Thomas's horse run away? Well, because every time he went down to his master's father-in-law's house, he would give him enough to eat. And Frederick was so hungry that he would take the lash, he would take whatever trouble he would get in, but he was so hungry, he just wanted something to eat. So whatever pain was caused him after was worth it. He was just trying to stay alive. Again, Frederick compares the treatment of slaves to the treatment of horses. How? Well, because they're not given their humanity. They are not treated as humans. It is just one word from the master goes, and they aren't given any consideration. How does Master Thomas propose to break Frederick? Well, he says he's going to send him away for 1 year to Mr. Covey. And that, I guess, will break him because he is known as a slave breaker. So why is that use of the verb to break ironic? Well, because you can't really break, if a slave is already broken, how do you break them more? And it's ironic because what Mr. Thomas is doing by starving his slaves and by being mean to them, he has already done that. So why was Mr. Covey's reputation for breaking slaves of great value to him? Well, because he won't be hungry there. Doesn't matter what Mr. Covey does, he's not going to be hungry. And so maybe he won't Frederick wouldn't have to act out in order to go somewhere else to get something to eat, which was the whole reason for his attitude with Mr. Old. Why does Frederick suggest that Mr. Covey's pious soul adds to his reputation as a slave breaker? Well, because he doesn't have a lot. Mr. Covey doesn't have a lot to give. He doesn't own his land like a lot of the other plantation owners. He all he has is his reputation, and from his reputation, he gets free slave labor. And because of the fact that he doesn't own anything else, and he can get other plantation owners to give him the slaves for essentially nothing, and the slave owners think that it is a good deal, um, it makes him seem more down to earth because he doesn't have a great deal of wealth. So, yeah, that's a lot in that chapter. I'm glad I know the end of the story and that there's a happy ending for Frederick Douglass, but it really is a lot, he has to go through to get there. So, I hope you guys are paying attention and following along. I hope you're doing well. Continue to stay safe, wash your hands, and yeah, know that we miss you, and I'll talk to you soon. Alright, bye.